What tips do you have for those people who are thinking about submitting to a publisher?
There are, I think, two levels of that kind of entry advice, right? The first and most fundamental and often the hardest to do, which is why I'm always impressed with every submission we get, is to just write. It's very hard to actually get the time in and have a complete work regardless of what state it's in. And that initial draft is never going to be perfect. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Just write. So that's always the first advice.
January of this year, 2025, Flint Hills Publishing was able to take a significant step forward. We now have a full-time editor-in-chief, Nathan Fredrickson. I'm very excited to have you here, Nathan, today so we can have a little conversation so people can get to know about you and what it is that you are bringing to the house, which it is quite significant. I've told Nathan many times he is making me fearless. I really don't think there's a project that's going to come our way that Nathan could not add some tremendous value to it. So Nathan, thank you so much for all the wonderful work that you've done just in the short 4 or 5 months that we've been working together. So I would like you to explain to everyone a little bit about your background, about yourself.
Yeah, well, thank you for that glowing introduction. It's been great. And yeah, I've been really happy to take on a full-time role as an editor here, as our editor-in-chief, especially because I have a diverse background. So before I decided working full-time as editor for Flint Hills Publishing, I had periodically worked on and off as an editor. You know, I have a history as an amateur writer myself, have worked with a lot of other writers and done a lot of workshopping and mutual editing in my past. But professionally, I have a background as a clinical social worker, as a therapist, um, uh, which I found has led really nicely to a lot of the kind of work that I end up doing as an editor, especially because in my undergraduate degree, I studied cultural studies, I studied literary criticism, um, and I think that there are a lot of similar lessons between how to draw out people's authentic feelings in a way that's healthy for them as a therapist and how to draw out people's authentic creative vision and creative process in their writing work. So, although I've taken a non-traditional path towards an editing role, I think that my expertise has given me a lot of shared insight, and it's been great. It's been great to help people find that voice.
Well, Nate, if reviews are to be believed, and I think they are, you are getting some fantastic feedback with the authors that you have worked with. So hats off to you. Everybody wants, all my authors now want to know, well, what does Nathan think? Which frankly is just terrific. So
Mm.
there are different kinds of editing, correct? We know that for sure, right?
Yeah,
So
yes.
talk, address kind of the type of editing that you were focusing on.
So just like my philosophy as a therapist, it's very important to me as an editor to meet people where they're at and to figure out what their needs are in order for me to be able to help them best. So, you know, what kind of work I'm going to be doing with a manuscript does depend on who the author is, what their vision is, what the state of their manuscript is. But usually, broadly speaking, as someone who's doing the first pass, editing our initial drafts that we get, typically I'll be doing developmental editing. So that means that I'll be looking at the biggest picture of the manuscript, trying to identify its structure and identify strengths and weaknesses in that structure in order to usually reorganize the text. Frequently, I'll be asking authors to make additions as well as subtractions for the sake of trying to fit that more coherent, well-organized structure, and that is going to be um, the best for exploring the main themes, the most important characters, or even if that's just finding the way to structure the narrative so that the author's voice comes through the most strongly. So again, it's diverse. It can look like a lot of different things, but since I'm doing that first pass, usually I'm taking as big of an overhead view as possible and thinking, what are the fundamentals of this manuscript. What is its skeleton, and how can we make sure that it's as strong as possible before moving on to later phases, which I will sometimes also do, that can get as minute as typos and minor grammatical details. But for the most part, I'm looking at that big picture structure from a developmental editing perspective.
Well, Nate, one of the strongest feedback I've got, one of the strongest ideas is I've had several authors you work with tell me he gets it. And he gets what I'm trying to say. And I can tell they've just been really touched that you have understood their work. So what is your physical approach? I mean, you have developed a pretty specific kind of step-by-step of what you're doing when you're working with an author, let's say at that more intense, that more developmental level. What's your approach?
Yeah, so as I said before, it is going to be a little different depending on who I'm working with and what the state of their manuscript is. But typically, what I'll do is have an initial meeting with our author, get a sense of who that author is, what their work is in their own view. I'll usually ask some critical questions like, what is your core theme? What is it you're trying to say? But also some questions that maybe especially new authors don't always consider, such as who's your target audience? Who is it that you want to be reading this? What kind of person do you imagine really getting engaged with this text? And those are the kind of questions that, really need that initial conversation to suss out and can help both of us get on the same page about what the spirit of the manuscript is or ought to be. After we develop some rapport and get to know each other and get on the same page about the manuscript, I'll do an initial read. Usually it's just an initial survey before getting too deep into the details. I just want to get as good of an overhead view as possible. And then I'll go back in after that for a close reading and annotation. So, I'll be, after having written some personal notes about me trying to sketch out the structure and general strengths and weaknesses, I will go line by line. And sometimes, it'll be as simple as correcting as a typo, but most of the time it involves making annotations on a line by line basis, maybe making comments on these structural things that I've already discussed, or making comments on style. And in general, trying to present a series of notes that are specifically referencing critical aspects of the text for the purpose of helping to develop the manuscript into something with a better structure, a stronger voice. That's usually what my annotations are focused on. After that, I will send an annotated copy back to the author, and the author will review the notes, make the changes that they deem appropriate. Having our authors maintain creative control is very important to me. So I consider all my annotations suggestions and collaborative in nature. So the authors will decide whether or not they agree or whether or not they share a vision. A lot of times I'll present a variety of options, things that I think, make sense, directions I think make sense to go in. And the author can pick whatever one that they think is most true to their original vision. So then they'll get me a new draft. I'll look through it again. Usually I won't make another annotation process. I'll just take some personal notes and hopefully have conversations with the author along the way so that we continue to remain on the first page or on the same page. So once we're done with that, we'll go through that process as many times as we feel it needs in order to get a draft that especially the author can be proud of putting out there and they think is staying true to their original vision. But usually after a couple of close passes like this, then we're ready to go on to proofing and formatting phase, which is our final editing and proofing phase before we send any of our books to print.
Right, and you're not involved in that part, then that comes to another section of the house, and we do a very close proof editing of the Word document. Then it gets formatted into the file it needs to be for the print and print copy of the book. And then once we get that advanced reader copy or proof copy of the book, it goes through yet another round of proof editing. So it's quite a long process, but it's necessary because we want to create error-free, most well-written version that we can. And the only thing I would add is that in our contracts, we are specific that the author has final say over all wording. But Nathan, I think you can be quite persuasive in your suggestions.
I'll always make my point, but again, it's important to all of us that the authors maintain control. And, we're just here to try and help make someone's vision for their work as strong as it can be and to produce as best of a work as they can. So
Right,
if
right.
they're,
Well,
if that's what they get, then I'm happy. Yeah.
well, and also we have a submission process, so we're only taking those works that we feel, represent the kind of quality that we're creating at Flint Hills Publishing. And you're on that submissions committee, and I have been impressed. You are very good at getting to the heart of the matter on the slush pile books pretty quickly.
Mhm.
So, with that experience and your background, can you provide to those wannabe authors out there, those people who have a manuscript or maybe just started thinking about writing a book, what tips would you give them? And I would say too that you're not, you feel comfortable in both fiction and nonfiction. We publish a lot of
Mhm.
memoirs. You're also working on some really fascinating long fiction works as well.
Mhm.
What
Mhm.
tips do you have for those people who are thinking about submitting to a publisher?
So since we work with a lot of people who are maybe writing their first long form manuscript, a lot of people who've done lots of writing in professional or hobbyist capacities, but a lot of times this is the first time they're really putting something really big together. So there are, I think, two levels of that kind of entry advice, right? The first and most fundamental and often the hardest to do, which is why I'm always impressed with every submission we get, is to just write. It's very hard to actually get the time in and sit down and have a complete work, regardless of what state it's in. And the reason why we have an editing process is because that initial draft is never going to be perfect. So don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good. Don't worry about it being the absolute best manuscript it can be, just from a completely fresh blank page. Just write. So that's always the first advice. But the second advice, once you're able to have that discipline or put in that work to actually complete it, which again is very impressive, is to start thinking about some of these biggest picture structural questions first. So that can mean a variety of things depending on what kind of work you're producing. But be it fiction or nonfiction, I'm always asking authors, what is your core theme? What is it you're trying to say? What are some repeating motifs that might exist in this work that can help bring out this theme? Um, Again, that can be done in a variety of different ways, but in other words, if you don't have a point, if you don't have something that unifies or ties together the entirety of a manuscript, simply because you've sat down and just written for an extended period of time, without that point, it's going to meander, it's going to lose focus, it's not going to be clear what it is that you're talking about or what your vision for this work is. So have a clear vision in mind. That vision may go somewhere else. It doesn't have to be super specific. For example, if you're writing fiction, you don't need to write out every little twist and turn for every single character arc before you actually start putting pen to paper or fingers to keyboard. Um, but have a good idea of what this is all about at its core and what kind of methods you want to use to get there. Again, it's going to depend a lot depending on whether or not it's fiction or nonfiction, or who your target readership is. Um, but if you can stay true to what do I know are my strengths as a writer, how can I use that to have the best possible technique to convey something that is coherent, something that has a clear vision. Those are the kind of questions you should begin by asking yourself once you've completed that initial rough draft, and especially asking yourself if you stay true to that.
Thank you, Nate. Now, Nate, I know we're keeping you mighty busy recently, but Nathan is available for hourly consultation. A lot of times when authors reach out to me, they're at the beginning process. I tell them an hour with Nathan early on in that process can really save them a lot of time and frustration, because Nathan can help workshop with you to figure out where it would be great to go with your work. He's got a million ideas. So Nathan, as I said, you really do make me feel fearless. You make me brave. Thank you for sharing your incredible intellectual energy with the publishing house. I know there are many authors who are very grateful to have connected with you, and I know that I certainly am. So thank you, Nate.
No, thank you. Yeah, it's great talking about it.
Goodbye.